All right, very good. Thank you, Bill. Okay, so welcome everyone to the commercial real estate in the COVID era. We did want to have this seminar because we're looking at part of the Chicago Minority Supplier Development Council's mission is to develop corporations. We certify, we advocate for, we connect, and develop is a major thing. And one of the matters that we found is that leases is a fixed cost that is very hard in this era of the revenues being unsure. And so we wanted to do what we could to bring you some tools to be able to look at your lease and see how we can, see how you can work with your lease to make it work better for you. What we're going to do in today's program is all your questions, you could go ahead and chat your questions in, and I'm going to read the questions to Bill throughout the program. After the program, and I'll say this again later on, we're going to send these slides, and I'll send you Bill Himmelstein's information later as well. So just a little bit about the Chicago Minority Supplier Development Council. I don't know if you've noticed from my emails that I am paid under a grant from the Department of Commerce called the Minority Business Development Agency Business Center. The council has a few centers that give services on behalf of minority suppliers. We have the Business Center here in Chicago and in St. Louis, where we have procurement and financial consulting abilities, and then we have the same Business Center out in St. Louis with other professionals. And we have a CARES Act Center that is dedicated to small businesses. We have an export center that helps you to export, and with a focus on Africa. And we have a technical assistance center from the tollway. So in these ways, we could assist in helping you grow your business and using our network to help you expand out. Now, I am an attorney, and I offer to you that I can review leases and give you, when you enter into a new lease, give you comments on it for you to look at. We don't charge a fee for that. I just give you some comments as from my perspective what you could look at. But the key is that I don't negotiate leases, and I don't really have an insight on how to negotiate a lease. That's why I wanted to bring in Bill Himmelstein. Now, William Himmelstein is the founder and CEO and managing broker of Tenant Advisory Group. Now, we're very excited to have him here, and he has been a great supporter of MBEs. He's been on our panel close to a decade ago. We just realized it's been a little while, and amazingly, Bill still looks exactly the same. So we are excited. And so, Bill, if you can tell me to advance the slides, I'm going to get you going. Again, if you have any questions, go ahead and chat them in. Bill?
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Josh. I'm honored to be here. And, my goal today is just to impart some knowledge about what's going on in the market and how you might be able to take advantage of this for your business. If there's any questions, Josh is going to just interrupt me. I'm very open for questions or anything that you might want to dive into more about. So I'm going to try and go through the slide presentation as quickly as possible to really get to the meat of the issues, which I believe is at the very end. So we'll go to the next slide. Yep. It's there's 7 key points of discussion, one of which we're actually going to skip. We're going to talk about the state of the current market, like those stats and figures that you read about in the newspapers and cranes about vacancy rates, the amount of sublease space on the market and what the rental rates are. But then the next step, we're going to go through and talk about how those actually compare historically. Putting those numbers into context is very important. We'll touch on what the different sectors are doing, both retail, office, and industrial. We'll talk a little bit about buying versus selling or buying versus leasing. A key thing we're going to touch on is what are business owners actually saying? Should they keep their space versus going completely remote? Are they going to stay in the city versus going to the suburbs? And so, a lot of people, they might be talking to different people in their community, but I've spoken to well in excess of 250 business owners since the beginning of COVID. So I've got a real good finger on the pulse of what these business owners are saying. We're going to skip this section 6 about how to come back to the workplace safely, but I do have some materials after the presentation that I will share with all the registered participants. And with that issue, as well as all these other things, I will always be available to jump on a call, a Zoom, answer questions, talk about any of these in more detail that you want. And then lastly, this is really the coup de grace, is ways that you can take advantage of the current market conditions. What can you do with your business to save money or not spend as much as you are right now? So we'll flip to the next slide and dive right into it. The state of the current market as of the end of the third quarter, there was, in the third quarter alone, an additional 3 million square feet of sublease space that came on the market, making the total of sublease space in the Chicagoland area to 9 million square feet, which is the largest amount of sublease space Chicago has had in its history. We're also looking at 6 million square feet of new developments that have broken ground in the quarter, of which, of that 6 million square feet, 3.8 million square feet is still available. So only 2.2 million square feet has been pre-leased. The vacancy rate has now climbed to just shy of 13%, which is its highest point since 2014. Rental rate growth has dropped to 0.5% year over year. Now, keep in mind, that is rental rate growth has slowed to 0.5% year over year, which is the lowest it's been since the fourth quarter of 2009. I think we all can remember what was going on then. It wasn't pretty. Class A rental rates, we're at an average of about $38 per square foot. This is downtown Chicago office space, by the way. Class B space is renting for about an average of $23.50, and Class C is at $19. I'm sorry, that's not downtown office space. That's office space throughout the Chicagoland market. Josh, we can hit the next slide. So what's really important when you hear these numbers and these statistics is to put it into context. And a great context is, how does it compare historically? So we have a total of over 500 million square feet of space and almost 210 million square feet of office space just in downtown Chicago alone. So when we're talking about adding, getting to 9 million square feet of sublease space, it's really about 1% of the overall vacancy rate due to subleases. When we're talking about 6 million square feet of new developments hitting the breaking ground in the third quarter, it really represents less than 1% of total inventory. And then the 3.8 million square feet that has not been pre-leased represents, about 0.5% of vacancy. And none of that development or the buildings that are under development, they have not been accounted for on the vacancy rates. That will account once those buildings open up. That's when those vacancy rates are actually accounted for. We can go to the next slide. And so historically, what we've seen, so to put some color around the vacancy rates that we have today, that 12.9%, the last two economic expansion periods, the vacancy rates got to as low as about 7 to 8%, and this is for downtown office space. The last two recessions, the vacancy rate climbed to as high as 17 or 18%, depending on whose numbers you're looking at. So when we were talking to brokers and commercial real estate firms and landlords, they talked about equilibrium, which is considered the point where there's not a clear advantage for the landlord nor the tenant. We talk about that number as being 12.5%. So right now, it being just under 13%, it is definitely tenant favorable, but we're not that far from an equilibrium point. We do anticipate vacancy rates to continue climbing. But right now, landlords are not in a catastrophic mode. Let's look at the next slide. So in terms of the current market, we talked about how rental rate growth is slowing, but it is predicted to turn negative in the middle of 2021. We haven't so far in the last 7 months, we haven't seen the direct landlords dropping their rates too much at all. What we are seeing from the direct landlords is additional concessions being offered, like more free rent and more tenant improvement dollars. Where you are going to find strong deals is on the sublease market. So the next slide, we'll talk about on the sublease market. One important thing to keep in mind, I've had a lot of clients reach out to me saying, Bill, there's 9 million square feet of sublease space on the market. There should be tons of opportunities for me. Well, what we need to keep in mind is that when you're looking for a sublease, for example, what we've put in this slide is, let's say you're seeking a 5,000 square foot sublease or space. You're a law firm, so you want a law firm build out, meaning perimeter privates with cubicles in the middle. Essentially, that's a typical build out for a law firm. And you're looking for a term of between 3 and 5 years, and you want to be in the central loop. Well, unless you find that exact specific sublease with 5,000 square feet, with a law firm build out in the central loop, with that amount of term remaining, no other sublease is going to work for you. For example, Groupon at the very beginning of the pandemic announced they were putting 150,000 square feet of space on the market. Well, that's not going to work for you unless you're at least a 75,000 square foot tenant that doesn't mind being at 600 West Chicago. So just because there's 9 million square feet of sublease space on the market doesn't mean that you're going to find a match for you and your business in the area you want to be in the size you need it to be, with the term that you'd want to see, and of course at the rental rate that you're looking for. So that needs to be kept in mind. Just because there's a lot of sublease space doesn't mean that there's a ton of opportunities for your specific business wherever you may be. Let's go to the next slide, please. So there was an interesting study done by Jones Lang LaSalle, and what it was talking about is over the next 3 years, what's going to happen to the vacancy rate in commercial real estate across all assets across the United States. What they predicted was that due to companies going out of business, due to companies downsizing, and due to companies expanding their work from home policy and potentially needing less space, they predict an increase of 10% in the vacancy rates over the next 3 years across all asset classes across the U.S. However, on top of that number, they also predict a 10% increase in demand due to economic growth and due to the change in density. Now, the next slide is a really interesting one because in the 20 years that I've been doing representing tenants in the commercial market here in Chicago, 20 years ago, across all industries, downtown office space had an average per square foot of 470 feet per person. If you think back, especially leading the way was law firms, right? All the partners would have massive offices and huge conference rooms. Each attorney had their own secretarial station. So let's fast forward. What we've seen over the last 20 years, we now have downtown office space across all industries. The average amount of square feet per person has dropped to 190 square feet per person. What that means is people have been jamming more and more people into their space over the last 20 years. But what JLL's study is suggesting, and myself and other experts in the real estate field are agreeing with, is that there's going to be a decrease in the density, meaning an increase in square feet per person, because now we're talking about, space designs that are including health and wellness protocols, which will account for more square feet per person in the office space. So essentially, JLL is predicting a net change of 0% in demand for space over the next 3 years. obviously, in the moment during the pandemic, we are seeing lots of sublease space coming on the market. We're seeing companies going out of business, and we're seeing companies downsizing in general. So going to the next slide, let's talk about.
Bill, before you do, can I,
please,
if I wanted to follow up, but so much of media talks about, and I know our own nonprofit is working from home with only some of us coming back, and we're really thinking that we might keep some working at home capabilities. And so much media is talking about that these law firms are downsizing and keeping a lot of their clients a lot of their partners working from home and only coming in occasionally. That JLL study accepts that and incorporates that, because I think that 100%. Would suppress demand.
Absolutely. And the reason, though, right now, when people are working from home and companies aren't having their people coming into the workspace, that doesn't mean that they're not paying rent, right? They still have a lease. And for the most part, landlords are reporting strong collections. I believe the number was about 96 or 97% of the pre-COVID level. So landlords are still collecting rent, even if companies aren't working. They're collecting rent, even if companies are subleasing their space. And, I'm happy to address the issue of these companies adapting well to the working from home strategy. What JLL is taking into consideration is that that's not going to be a way for successful companies to continue to build and grow by having a fully remote workforce. There are so many things, and these studies have been done over the last many decades of why do companies have office space. There's a couple of main reasons why companies have a centralized space, whether it's office or industrial. And some of those reasons include team building, collaboration, culture building, a sense of community with their team members, which all those three things lead to more employee engagement and employees sticking around with a company for longer. Working from home might be productive. We're seeing very high productivity numbers, but that's not the metrics that leaders use to determine if they've got a successful growing business over the long term. One major thing that companies will lack with a fully remote workforce is that knowledge transfer that we get from the senior executives passing things on to the younger or newer workforce that they have. You don't get people chatting next to the water cooler. You don't get the senior executives answering questions constantly that they're getting from their newer employees. So it's really a challenging time for the younger workforce or the new people newer to a company to assimilate, to learn, and to bring as much value as they can. So yes, newspapers need to sell their media, and that's why they'll throw out a number like 9 million square feet of sublease space. Oh my gosh, the world is ending. This is horrible. But when you factor that into the overall market, which they don't give you those numbers, they don't say 9 million square feet. Really, that only represents about not even 1% of vacancy. And so putting those numbers into context really helps to change things. And we'll get in later, Josh, to what business owners are saying. But right now, I'd love to just, if we can, maybe there's other questions, we can certainly address that. But I think the media is there to sell newspapers and to present the numbers and the statistics, not in an all-inclusive fashion, but the one that's going to get the most eye-opening. Wow, that seems horrible. But then when you understand it as a whole, it's not as eye-popping. It's not as dramatic. So now one sector that really is struggling, we see on this slide, is retail. The rents in the overall market have dropped 2% in the last 12 months. The Chicagoland area has seen over 100 store closures led by the hospitality industry, and they predict that there's going to be another 100 store closings over the next 12 months. However, over the last 12 months, retail has absorbed an additional 500,000 square feet. That's been led by experiential users, which has been like axe throwing and activities where you go to a game playing, those online games that are being played, and as well as medical. Medical has been taking a lot of that additional retail space. However, these current market conditions where we've got shutdowns, limiting the time and the amount of people that can come into, say, your restaurant, these conditions are going to continue to force retailers to close their shops, which are going to increase vacancy rates. And when vacancy rates go up, the rental rates will continue to come down. So we're seeing a lot of headwinds on the retail sector. Now, the next sector, industrial, they seem to be doing really well. There's been over 14 million square feet of net absorption over the last 12 months, fueled highly in part by Amazon's acquisition of 7 million square feet just in 2020 alone, bringing the total amount that Amazon alone occupies to over 15 million square feet in the Chicagoland area. Over that last 12 months, rental rates in the industrial sector have increased by 4%, and that is expected to continue. So while Amazon and others are out there gobbling up space, there's been almost 21 million square feet of new construction over the last 12 months. And that's still, and we talked about this 14 million square feet of net absorption. So the vacancy rate is still a very low 6%. And that's led by both Amazon with their push to have that last mile space, warehouse space covered, as well as there's been a tremendous desire for cold storage, meaning instead of people going to the grocery store to buy their groceries, they're ordering them from, Amazon and other retailers that are now bringing you your groceries. And so they need cold storage next to as many residents as possible. So the industrial sector is really moving along very strongly right now. The next slide talks a little bit about buying versus selling. And I always talk about buying, the industrial sales process is really the three key dependents are location, the type of property you have, and the price you're listing it for. But overall in the markets, the industrial sector has seen a $4.6 billion in sales volume over the last 12 months, with purchase prices going up 2.8% over that time. Retail has been met with caution from both the lenders and the investors alike. However, there still is a strong demand for single tenant triple net leases with strong financials. So high triple net or triple A credit tenants, those properties are trading still very heavily as investors look to park their money into safer opportunities. However, in the retail sector, the sales volume failed to hit 400 million in the second quarter for the first time since 2012. So there's really been a slowdown in the retail investment sales sector. So these next couple of slides are talking about what business owners are saying, what they're thinking, and what they're doing. The next slide talks about me. I mentioned earlier that I've spoken to well over 250 business owners. And despite what you may be hearing from others, I've only talked to 2 business owners that have said they plan to never come back to the office. One of those was a business that was already going under pre-pandemic, and this is really accelerating their path to shutting their doors. And the other business owner, they already had one foot out the door. They were always in odd locations, and they never had much of a value placed on the office space in general. So most business owners, I'm saying, they all are anxious to come back to the office. Their employees want to get back to the office. They just want to wait until it's safe. The next slide talks about, what are these business owners thinking?
Bill, before you go into that, there was a question going back to you're talking about retail versus industrial. This is a question that we had. Where do you see mixed-use commercial space going the next 12 months? Mixed use in terms of commercial space for business that rent time to use the facility, like office space and commercial kitchen space, that shared space concept.
Yeah, I definitely see an increase in that because there's going to be a more increase in demand for spaces like that because having mixed use diversifies your risk. It spreads out your risk. So if you've got a little bit of retail space in your building, you got a little bit of office space in your building, maybe you even have some residential in your building, but it serves to de-risk your investment in that property. So another thing that we're going to see is shorter terms. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, but while we have a lot of uncertainty with both the pandemic and still with the election, we're going to see people, if they have to commit, they're going to be much shorter terms to those leases, whether it's office, industrial, or retail. So I hope that answers that question. I do see an increase in mixed-use opportunities and development.
And as far as you've seen that the mixed use as an industry is going to weather this pandemic?
I think so. I think anyone if you have the least amount of retail as possible, you've got a good chance of weathering the pandemic. We haven't seen, I'm not the expert on residential, but residential has been holding up very well. In fact, what I'm reading is that we're at the strongest market residentially and this is both Chicago and the suburbs, that we've had in a very long time. So there's properties are trading faster. There's less inventory, so prices are either staying firm or going up on the residential side. But again, I'm not a residential expert, but when you can talk about mixed use, and a lot of times a big part of that is residential, that sector is still holding up pretty well. When I'm talking to business owners, what they're thinking about, the questions they're asking me is, how do we return to the office safely? When can they get back to they want to get back to the office as soon as possible, or their manufacturing plant or their retail space. And what will that layout need to look like going forward? That's something that we address later. But on the doing side, what my clients and the business owners that I'm talking to are doing is that they're seeking ways to get free rent, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. They're looking at rent deferral opportunities or lease restructurings, and they're seeking ways to terminate an existing lease so that they can come back to the office or their industrial plant later after the market has softened, and negotiating will be much more tenant favorable. So the last one when I'm talking to folks is, are they staying downtown? And the overwhelming answer is yes. In fact, I haven't spoken to a single business owner that has their offices downtown that has said, we're out of here, we're moving to the suburbs. The reason in the last 10 years we've had a huge migration of businesses from the suburbs to the cities. The reasons for that was, really where any business, some of the factors they consider of where they want to be located is they want to be near their talent, they want to be near their customers, they want to be near their vendors, and they also want to be near dining and entertainment options. Those reasons of where you want to locate your office aren't going to be changing. They might be changing in the near term where we've got this pandemic going on, and we did have some civil unrest with the riots and the race riots. But overall, businesses still want to be near where their team members are, where their talent is, and near their customers. And doing those things and locating in a space, that's what keeps your employees loyal and productive over the long term. What are clients doing for planning for the future? What I've been telling people is that for every client I have that is looking to downsize or sublease their space, I've got the same amount of clients that are growing and that are seeking new space and looking to relocate. The biggest difference that I'm seeing is with our listings. So those clients of mine that are trying to get rid of space and sublease space, they're getting little to no activity. In the past, for any sublease listing we had, we would see 1 to 2 inquiries every week. Now, we're mostly getting 0 inquiries. Sometimes we'll get 1 inquiry. And unless you're priced appropriately, and on a sublease, you need to be priced fairly aggressively, we're not getting much traction on those. So what's happening is a lot of these business owners are struggling to plan for the long term. And so the ones that do have leases coming due, they're executing much shorter term leases, taking more of a wait and see approach with both the pandemic and still waiting to see what's going to happen with the election. We anticipate, we see this every election year, there's a wave of activity post-election, regardless of whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And I think we're going to see a tremendous amount of activity once it's announced that there's an effective and safe vaccine. Now, that's not when a vaccine is going to be widely distributed. I think once we have a sense of, okay, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, there is a vaccine that's been approved by the FDA with whatever percent effective rate it might be, I think people are going to feel a lot safer, and they're going to come back to both the office and the industrial space. Before we move on, was there a question that had popped in, Josh?
Yes, there sure was. Attendee said, we have a termination clause in our lease. So he was looking at that one note that you said that some clients are doing exactly that to negotiate a better terms. If we decide to use it to exit our lease and decide to lease again in the future under more favorable conditions, will the landlords be concerned that we terminated a lease and therefore have difficulty in securing a new lease?
Excellent question. The answer is, it's possible that your current landlord might think that, but that's the only landlord that's going to know it. This is not public record. Landlords do not in fact, they typically don't communicate with each other. I haven't, in my 20 years of doing this, I've never gone to a landlord where they've said, well, we've heard about this tenant from their previous landlord. So the answer is no. Now, if you stay with your existing landlord, they probably will be more hesitant to grant you a right to terminate because they don't want to see you taking advantage of it. But that's the point. That's a very, very tenant-favorable term to have in your lease, is a right to terminate it. Landlords hate to give it, and tenants, really what a right to terminate is, regardless of what's going on in the market, a right to terminate is really a right to renegotiate your lease. And so whether there's a penalty or not, we can always talk about that. But having a right to terminate if you're a tenant is an incredibly favorable term to have in your lease. And no other landlord will even know that you terminated your lease.
Very interesting. So then it can give you a leg up on negotiating with your current landlord, or give you an opportunity to get brand new, fresh terms at another space. 100%.
It's such a valuable clause to have in your lease. Landlords hate giving it, and it's an amazing thing for tenants to have. And you know, I'm always willing to talk offline about the strategic ways to utilize, to optimize that right to terminate. And it's just a great thing for tenants to have.
But it doesn't turn up on your credit report or anything.
Absolutely not. Nope, that is not public information. So the next couple of slides, we talk about the best practices for returning to the workplace safety. We're going to skip over that because I think people are, from what I read in the comments of people joining this webinar, was really about the last couple slides, which are ways you can take advantage of current market conditions. So perfect. Yeah, we're right there. So we can go to the next slide. The first one talks about getting free rent. And obtaining free rent. Right now, what I'm seeing on behalf of my clients is, and we can go to the next slide, Josh. It's standard procedure for a landlord to offer rent deferment. Now, that's helpful for some folks. What that means is, let's say you get 3 months of rent, of free rent, but then you got to pay that back over the remaining course of your lease. That's typically how it's displayed. However, this isn't good enough for some folks, and what they're going to want is actual rent abatement. But either way, whether you're going to ask for a rent deferment or rent abatement, you're going to need to be prepared to show your financials. Show that.
I'm sorry, Bill. Can attendees stay in your? Okay, you lost sound, Michael.
Are just much better landlords, basically, is we have seen a few months of rent, maybe several half months of rent offered with very little to nothing in return. So it's possible to get a landlord to say, all right, we're going to give you 3 months of half free rent. Because keep in mind, a lot of these landlords, they're getting and have gotten relief from their lenders, where they've been able to skip a mortgage payment or, pay a couple half months of mortgage and tacking it on at the end or something like that. But more often than not, what we're seeing is you will have to offer something in return to the landlord, like additional term, in order to get some free rent now. And that is what leads me to the next slide.
Oh, Bill, and then, I'm sorry. And then, Bill, can you say, is it different when you ask for free rent at the outset versus 2 years into an existing lease kind of thing?
Well, I would say normally, yes. Typically, a landlord's going to say, you can go pound sand. You signed the lease. It is what it is. We're not going to make any changes. This is a very different situation with this global pandemic. And, for a while, we weren't even allowed to go to our offices and go to our space. And now we can do it in reduced numbers, reduced density. But a lot of companies, their people and their leadership just aren't feeling safe going back. So it's a really different time where now, yes, typically at the beginning of a lease, you should have a free rent period. What we're saying now is we're going back to landlords saying we're experiencing financial hardship, not due to anything from our business that we did wrong. It was due to this global pandemic. And if we're going to survive this pandemic and continue to be an on-time rent-paying tenant of yours, Mrs. Landlord, we need to have some relief. We need to be able to reduce the rent we have now. We need to have a couple months free. And so, to the question, it's very common to have rent up front. It's extremely uncommon to have rent in the middle of a term unless that's negotiated up front. But right now, given the times that we're facing, landlords they've gone to their lenders to get relief. And I think it's reasonable as a tenant to go to your landlord seeking some relief. And, that first slide that we just passed through, this is the perfect slide to be on right now. But we talked about, yes, you should ask. You should absolutely ask your landlord for relief. Be prepared to show if your business has been going just fine, there's been no changes, or you're growing, you're not going to get any rent relief. But if you can show that your second quarter compared to last year's second quarter was down 10, 15, 20 plus %, you should be able to get some sort of relief. And one of the biggest ways that we're seeing is through a lease restructure. So you take an existing lease and assume that, let's say you've got 3 years or less left on your term. You can restructure that. And usually if you have an opportunity, if you need to downsize your space, or of course, if you need to grow your space, you should be able to take the remaining term. So let's just say you've got 3 years left. And if you add additional term, we can drop your rental rate. So if you were paying $30 a square foot, yet you add some term to your lease, you might be able to drop your rental rate to $25 a foot, as well as get some free rent. We call this strategy a blend and extend. You're blending your rental rate down by giving the landlord a longer term of cash flows, even if that rental rate is lower, but they've got more term out of their tenant. And so that's a strategy that can be discussed further offline, or if there's more questions about that, I'm happy to address. But then the next slide, we've had some of our clients talk about, hey, we would like to terminate our lease, even if they don't have a right to terminate. And they're talking about what are some ways that we can effectively walk away from our lease without getting pursued by the landlord. Now, the main key here, I want to note, I am not an attorney. I am not qualified to give legal advice. But with my experience in terminating leases without a right to terminate, I've done this before the pandemic 3 times. Post-pandemic, I've done it an additional 4 times. The biggest key in terminating a lease and walking away from a lease and saying, landlord, here's the keys, we can't pay this anymore, is to find, first of all, is looking at the terms in your lease to seeing what kind of language that the landlord has to provide the landlord's duty. Say they have to provide a safe and quiet enjoyment is typically in every lease, which means they have to provide an effective work environment for you to conduct your business. If the HVAC has been breaking, if there's unsafe characters that are constantly hanging around your building, there's a lot of different ways to approach this. Typically, without a right to terminate, there is going to be some risk involved, but I will tell you that even before the pandemic, it was extremely rare for a landlord to pursue a tenant if they walked away from a lease. That's part of the risk of being a landlord, is that some of your tenants are going to go under, or they're not going to perform under the requirements of their lease, aka paying their rental rate. Especially right now when the courts aren't even seeing eviction cases. So there's an incredibly long backlog where tenants have stopped paying rent but stayed in their space, and landlords are filing these evictions that aren't being seen by the courts till who knows when. Now, when they are seen by the courts, keep in mind we are in a heavily democratic state and have a heavily democratic judges in our court system, which means they typically are going to favor the individual as opposed to the big corporation. They're going to favor the tenant versus the landlord. And when we've got an argument to saying, Judge, it was a global pandemic. My business was down 20%. The lease was going to put us out of business, and then I was going to have 30 employees without a job if I didn't walk away from this lease to stay in business. So what I'm hearing from the attorneys that I'm talking to, and now keep in mind, attorneys, their job is to help their clients minimize risk and avoid risk. But the question to ask yourself, is it so risky that this could put me out of business by continuing to pay this lease? There's a lot of ways to, what I'll say is, skin the cat and evaluate this situation. It needs to be done over a longer conversation. I always will bring in an attorney as well to listen and have this conversation with my clients to understand the situation. Has the landlord created a default? Like, have they not had the HVAC working properly? Most landlords should have reached out to their tenants with their COVID policy. How are they handling things during COVID? If they haven't, that could potentially be a grounds for landlord default and walking away from a lease. But anyone that can effectively walk away from a lease right now because presumably you signed it pre-pandemic, so your rental rates were going to be higher up here. And when you're ready to come back to your space, whether it's office, retail, industrial, the rates are going to be a lot more tenant favorable. So that's a strategy that we are pursuing with several of our clients. It can be done. It's not always the case. And oftentimes it does take a little bit of risk on the part of the tenant to do that. But more often than not, landlords are not coming after the tenants because it's just not a winning proposition. It's going to end up costing them a lot more money. It's going to take them a significant time period to pursue this. And they don't often win, especially in a time like this. So I'm always happy to talk about more of, well, anything that was in this presentation. You know, we will always take time to communicate and listen and ask questions and give our feedback. But at this time, you know, I'm happy to open it up to more questions if there were any, Josh.
Okay, very good. One of the questions that somebody had was, how do you have leverage to negotiate a terminating lease clause? What kind of leverage could there possibly be to convince a landlord to offer that clause?
The leverage is that you'll terminate and move somewhere else. And so presumably there's going to be anywhere from 2 to 5 years left on that lease. Yes, sometimes, oftentimes, a termination clause includes a termination penalty. So the tenant will have to pay the landlord. Typically, it's unamortized cost of a transaction. So the unamortized cost of the free rent, unamortized cost of tenant improvement dollars, as well as leasing commissions, and sometimes there might be a couple of months of rent. So the landlord might get the equivalent of 6 to 8 months of rent in that penalty. However, the new landlord for the tenant oftentimes will pick up that termination penalty. They might give a significant period of free rent at the new space, at the new building. And so the leverage is essentially saying, look, not only are you going to get this space back, Mrs. Landlord, but you're also going to have a significant downtime period. Even pre-pandemic, it would typically take a landlord anywhere from 6 to 9 months to release a space. But now it might be even longer. Plus, they're going to have a much lower rental rate that they're getting. So it's the best deal for a landlord is always to keep their existing tenants, even if it's at a lower rate. So using that right to terminate as the leverage for the tenant to say, hey, look, we'll walk. You know, sometimes terminations don't have any penalty. Well, that's the most incredible piece of leverage you could have as a tenant. But by saying we're going to exercise this right to terminate and we're going to walk away from this lease, it puts the landlord on the defensive by saying, well, we don't want to lose this tenant 3, 4, 5 years before their lease is up. We need to come in and say, all right, we're willing to restructure your lease to something that's more resembles the market conditions, and we'll drop your current rental rate and give you a period of free rent. And what they'll usually ask for in return is that you extend your lease a little bit longer than what it was. But there's great ways to exploit those rights to terminate to your benefit as the tenant. And we've done, you know, I'm not going to say we've done hundreds of them, but we've done many of them where it always typically works out very well for the tenant, regardless of what the market is doing.
We have another MBE that is considering, she's got a retail business and is considering going strictly online and leaving the bricks and mortar because the bricks and mortar is such high overhead. What do you say to her that justifies that high overhead?
So to justify it, I mean, I wouldn't try to convince her to keep it. That's not what I would say. I would say, how are your sales looking online? Are they growing? Well, you know, I mean, if you can do that, I think that's a wonderful thing to do. What's important to analyze is how much business was that retail space generating? Were people walking in and saying, oh, I'm so glad there's a widget store here. I need a widget. That to me, the retail landscape is changing dramatically, and it's a lot of it is going to that online sales, which in turn is what's driving the demand for industrial space. Because now what I've been saying is retail space really is now industrial, because instead of people going to a store to buy the widget, they're ordering it online and it's being delivered from a warehouse. So if your business can maintain its profitability by being entirely remote, I would say do it. I think that's a great thing to do. Now, one of the reasons, obviously, manufacturers can't go remote because you can't make that widget in your employees' homes. And office space isn't going remote because you need that collaboration. You need the knowledge transfer. You need the culture building to be a successful and growing business. Retail, the landscape is changing to online. So what I would say is that if you can still be a profitable business solely with an online presence, then God bless you. More power to you. I would do it.
Excellent. And we have one final question here. He says, I currently rent space for my engineering company with an eye towards purchasing a space in the future. Do you see the commercial real estate market in Chicagoland going through a market crash in the next 12 months like it happened in 2008? What is your anticipation there?
That's a wonderful question. Now, first of all, I've got a wonderful flyer on the pros and cons of leasing versus buying. And I'm going to share that with you, Josh, to share with your members after this presentation, because it talks about the pros and cons of both to allow you to think through some of those issues of, is buying the right thing to do and why? In terms of a crash, I really am not, on the difference, it varies on the different sectors. Retail, yes, retail is going to struggle, and it's going to get worse. Office, like I said earlier, we're at just under 13% vacancy. It'll increase. Do I think it'll surpass that 17 or 18% we were at the last two recessions? I do. I do think it's going to go past that. Is it going to go past? I don't think it'll get much past 20% vacancy rate, but that's a great thing for tenants. The higher the vacancy rate, the better it is for tenants. That's all we represent. Tenant Advisory Group doesn't work with landlords. We work with tenants. So when I see vacancy rates going up, I see rental rates coming down. And that's what I love for our tenants. So you talk about buying a space, depending on what it is. If it's office space, yeah, I think you're going to have some good opportunities to purchase at a low rate. If it's industrial space, I don't think you're going to have a great opportunity to buy at a really low price. That being said, if you can be a long-term holder of that commercial real estate, regardless of whether it's office, industrial, or even retail, I think you're going to do well over the long term. And I would never buy real estate hoping to get a quick appreciation. I'd never advise my clients to do that. I don't like that strategy. But if you are able to buy your real estate, hold it over the long term, and have a tenant occupying that real estate, whether it's your business or someone else's business, you will do very well economically, financially over the long term. Even if you don't get any appreciation, you will. There's a lot of tax benefits to the debt that you carry on a property. If it's your business that occupies the space, you can charge yourself what is defined as a very high rental rate. Obviously, you can't be exorbitant, but you can charge your business a very high rental rate. And what that serves to do is reduces the profit of your business. So it reduces your tax liability. And then the income that you're getting on the real estate, there's depreciation, there's the interest deduction, there's a lot of tax advantages where it makes a lot of financial sense to own the building that your business is in. And as long as you're going to plan on occupying that and when I say long term, I think 5 years is too short. I think if you're going to be there at least 7 years or longer, you'll do very well financially owning your own property.
Well, Bill, I really appreciate it. This has been very informative. Like I said, to all attendees, I'm going to send out the slides, send out information from Bill in a way to get in contact if you wanted to. I look forward to working with you in the future, Bill, and thank you again for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.